Hello, everybody. Welcome back to session 13 of church history. We are the chapter that I was actually going to be doing for this week is actually going to be split into two lectures because the first half of it is going to be talking about a man who casts a very, very large shadow. In fact, his shadow can be felt even today. One of two very big political leaders in church history. The first one is Constantine. You might have heard of Constantine, maybe. But I can almost guarantee you've heard of this man. His man is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a very, very big deal, as we will soon see. In fact, just about all of today is what we're going to be talking about Charlemagne for all of it. But before that, let's set a little bit of the scene. The church in the western half of Europe is not doing so hot. Like, they're doing really well with mission work. Like, they're doing pretty good at reaching out to the pagan tribes that are around. However, they're kind of losing the plot, if that makes sense. They're not really doing things the proper way. Because the Roman Empire fell 300 years ago, the main issue is that not only are the normal people uneducated, now the people who are in charge of the church, the clergies, they're beginning to be uneducated as well. So how are you going to do a church service if you don't know how to read? It's kind of tough, and they made it work, but over generations, the literacy levels of church members just went down and down and down, and eventually they were just sort of repeating what had been done without really knowing why it had been done. And there's going to be something we're going to talk about later called the Carolingian Renaissance that's going to come in. It's going to remedy a lot of this, but it's not going to really fix everything. In fact, the Carolingian Renaissance is actually going to salvage a whole lot of what's happening here, and we actually take advantage of major breakthroughs in the Renaissance, not the big capital R Renaissance. That's going to come much later. Does anybody know what Renaissance means? It's a French word. Yeah, renewal, rebirth. That's essentially it. We're in the Dark Ages right now. And this is kind of like the blip that keeps the Dark Ages from being like pitch black. But the clergy members, they can't read, so basically they are no longer preaching. They're not reading the Word of God. Instead, they're just doing more liturgical roles, where they're coming up and they're singing, they're doing the sacramental functions, like they're giving last rites, they're doing communion, they're baptizing, they're burying the dead, they're hearing confession, etc., but they're not preaching their own sermons because they can't read. Instead, they're going to do something else called a homily. Has anybody heard of a homily? Well, if you haven't heard it, my second question was going to be, do you know what it is? So a homily is a sermon that is written by somebody else that then is read aloud by someone. It'd be like if pastor read from a sermon that Spurgeon, that's the word I was looking for. I was like, it's Spurgeon. If pastor just got up here and just read word for word what Spurgeon had written, that'd be a homily of sorts. Pastor's not really doing any work his own self, it seems, but the word of God is still being spoken. But the art of sermon making just goes off a cliff here. And eventually, the sacraments, like the practice of communion, they stop giving it to church members entirely. A lot of the pagan tribes that are being converted right here, they're coming out of very strong paganism, and a lot of, you might recognize it as Norse religions, where they're coming out from the worship of Thor and Odin. Whenever they see this, like this is the body of God that is being put before us, we want nothing to do with this. That is way too much for us. So they just they take a step back and they say, we respectfully will not take part in this because it's too sacred for us. And that over time, it just wears down and wears down and wears down. And eventually, the priests stop giving communion to the church members. Instead, people will come to the church and watch the priests do communion themselves. They will watch the priests eat bread and watch the priests drink wine. And it was just very bizarre reading that. This began in kind of in the 5th century. So over the last couple hundred years, it has been slowly reaching this very, very low point. And right here is about where it's hitting its stride. So that's kind of the backdrop of what's happening in the church right here. But we've been talking about the Franks before, right? The Franks are north of Italy in an area you might have heard of called France. It's not France yet. By the end of tonight, it will be France, I promise. We're going to be spending basically the rest of our time talking about Charlemagne. And Charlemagne is such a big deal that to talk about Charlemagne, we have to talk about Charlemagne's grandpa. So we're going to talk about Charles Martel. And Charles, or that's what he is in one language. There are other words you might use for him, like Carlos. Carlos is also Charles. If I'm having trouble speaking, it's because I'm very, very low on sleep. We just had a baby, for those of you who did not know. And so if I stumble over my words, please have a little bit of grace while I try to collect my thoughts. And I will hope that the value of the study of history will move through my own imperfections. So Charles Martel is the founder of what's called the Carolingian dynasty, the line of Carlos, Carolingian, Carol. It all comes from the same root. So Charles the Hammer Martel is Charlemagne's grandfather, and he's not a king. He's not a king. He is, in fact, a mayor in the palace of the Merovingian kings, which are a Germanic group. They've got a fun name, but we're actually not going to talk about them at all. So he's not a king, but he effectively rules them. He's called a mayor, but he rules in this palace. He's a mayor in this palace. He was kind of a big deal. He's called the Hammer for a reason. Whenever we talked about the Muslims last time, they came in through northern Europe and up into Spain. Why did they stop in Spain? It's because of Charles Martel. This was the first time that somebody said no to Islam and kept them there. He stopped their advance from Spain into the rest of what will become Europe, and he didn't kick out the Muslims. They're going to be there for another 700 years, which is crazy to think about because we don't think of Spain as being like a Muslim country, but it was a Muslim country for longer than twice of the length of the United States of America. It's crazy. He leads his people, the Frankish people, in a victory against the Muslims in the year 732 at the Battle of Tours, which is in France. But this is basically, it's going to permanently halt the Western progress of the Islamic Empire, and they're going to keep them in Spain for another 700 years. A couple of lessons ago, I mentioned that there was a pope who started making alliances with Frankish leaders, right? This is where it starts. This is where it starts. He has very, very friendly contacts with the Roman popes because the popes and the Franks are being united against a group of people called the Lombards. The Lombards. He is going to help a man named Boniface. We're going to talk about him later. He's a very important missionary. He's going to assist him and other missionaries who are busy among the Germanic tribes of the north. So Boniface gets sent north with a whole lot of support, and he gets in good with Charles Martel. And because of that, because Boniface is a representative of the Pope, essentially this is seen as like, okay, we've got an alliance that's forming here. So Charles supports Boniface, and because Charles supports Boniface, naturally, he supports the Pope as well, right? Clearly, we all know this. So Charlemagne is going to get his start based on what his grandfather gets kick-started, which is then going to be taken the extra mile by his son, Pepin the Short. I don't know exactly how tall he was, but he's known as Pepin the Short, and that is how we will refer to our good boy Pepin. So Boniface does a lot of stuff. Boniface crowns Pepin the Short as king of the Franks. And notably, he does this not in the name of the empire, not in the name of the Byzantines, not to name him as a governor of the Byzantine Empire, but no, he says that you are now king of the Franks by the authority of the Pope. kind of a big deal. This is the first time that anybody has claimed apostolic authority, like because of the authority that has been given to the apostles that we now see through the line of apostolic succession. Because of this, we are now able to say that you are the king by the grace of the Pope in the name of God, something like that. That's the first time we see this, as the Pope can say, you are no longer king and you are king. Because, of course, everybody remembers that part in the Bible where Jesus said, I will give you the right to appoint kings and depose kings on your own. Everybody remembers this. Don't go looking for it because we all know it's there. However, this was good for the Pope because they needed political allies in the region. If you will remember, Byzantines are really long ways away. And there in Rome, in what's going to become Central Europe, there's a whole lot of Germanic tribes that are battling. They're going to take Rome several times over the course of a couple hundred years. It stands to reason that we want to have some significant political alliances in the area, and why not the Franks? I mean, we've got missionaries going to them. They're already friendly to us. Let's just go ahead and we're going to make some great alliances with these people. However, the new royal family in France, which we're going to start calling it France now, the Carolingian dynasty, the descendants of Charles Martel or Carlos, or Carl, you get it. It's all Charles, Chuck, the Chuck dynasty. Where did they get their authority? Who gave them the authority? Who made them king? The Pope did. So maybe the kings are going to be beholden to the Pope a little bit, Yeah, and that's Pope Zachary who crowns the king there. So the Frankish monarchy, with the backing of the church in the West now, becomes the central power over what is going to be called Europe. It's not Europe yet. It will be by the end of our lesson today. But that group of Germanic states and kingdoms and what remains of the western half of the Roman Empire, the Franks are now top dog. They are the head government in that area. And as a result of this, now the Franks and the popes, they are very, very good friends. Very good friends. As a quick note, I will say that typically in that region, what they would do is the king would have lots of kids, and there's a whole lot of land. It's too much for one person to rule alone. So basically, they would just divide their kingdom after they'd gone out and conquered a little bit of it, and they'd say, "All right, son 1, you get this half, and son 2, you get this half." So that way, the kingdom gets split by the king before the children start fighting amongst each other. And there are a couple of people who start fighting, but eventually, one child survives and inherits the kingdom, and that is what's going to be Charlemagne. Charlemagne, you might have heard of, here are a couple of other names for him. Does anybody know what Charlemagne means? Because that's a title as well as a name. Like, it didn't come out and they said, you shall be Charlemagne. Here are some other names for him. Carolus Magnus, Charles I, Charles le Grand, Karl der Grosse, Charles the Great, or in a sort of blend of Latin and French, Charles le Magnus, Charlemagne, and that comes to us as Charlemagne. That's the sort of the Americanized French Latin version of it, is Charlemagne. Charles the Great, Charlemagne. He becomes emperor in 768. And from the very beginning, he takes what his father, Pepin, who fought several decisive battles throughout his career, he takes what his father, Pepin, had done, and he runs with it. He inherits the entire kingdom, and he comes out the gate swinging. From the very beginning, he's expanding his own power, and you know what? We kind of like the church, so we're going to start making sure that our alliance with the Pope gets very, very deep-seated so that we can further depend upon one another. So the Lombards begin invading and attacking Rome, and they appeal to Charlemagne, and he says, an excuse to go fighting? Thank you. Thank you very much. So he goes in, and he kicks out the Lombards. He saves the Pope in that area. A lot of this land his father had taken from the Lombards, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, but essentially, if there was an invasive force that took American land, and in a couple of hundred years, somebody else came and retook those lands, you'd expect them to give them back to the United States, right? That's not what Pepin did. Pepin took the lands back from the Lombards, and instead of giving them to the Byzantine Empire, he said, "Hey, Pope, do you want this?" So he gives a whole lot of land over to the Pope. We'll talk about that more in a second. But essentially, that's kind of what's happening here, is we're deepening that sort of relationship where they're each depending upon one another. The popes are appealing to we'll say the church. The church is appealing to the Franks because the Franks have a strong military presence. They've got good leadership. And the Franks are conquering all of these pagan peoples, right? All these Germanic tribes that are around, like the Lombards and the Jutes. And remember that big map that I had a couple times ago? Well, we need a way to unite all of these people. The church has got some pretty strong unifying doctrines that we can depend upon. And the Franks are already kind of Christian, so if we just go ahead and make Christianity the official religion of the Frankish peoples, what will soon become the Kingdom of France, that's going to be a really good way to keep these people in line when we can now say, all right, you are now Christian, here is what you believe now. More on that in a minute. Eventually, the Pope gets caught in a scandal in the year 799, and they seek to get rid of him, and Charlemagne comes in and he saves the Pope. He defends him from that. The Pope was accused of many faults. I will let you look up what those are and see if whether or not you believe he was guilty of those. But here's what he does. Charlemagne comes out the gate as king, and he says, you know what? My kingdom isn't big enough. And he spends a whole lot of time conquering all of the tribes around. And he says, everything the light touches is my kingdom. All of this stuff is now mine. You are going to be my subjects. I will be your king. Here's a quote that's attributed to that. It says, no sovereign since Constantine had assembled so many territories beneath his scepter. Like Constantine, he appeared to mankind as the witness, as the herald of Christ. A huge deal. This man could not be beaten. In his military campaigns, he not only stopped the advance of Islam into Italy, he pushed them back. He attacked them and pushed them back behind the Alps. He conquered so many kingdoms up to the north, a whole lot of kingdoms over to the west. Might have butted heads with the Huns a couple of times if you want to do some more research on that. All the Germanic tribes become Franks after he conquers them. In 43 years of being emperor, he loses one battle. And he is a fighting king. He's not I'm going to go out and fight half a dozen fights or half a dozen times during this. No, in one of his campaigns that he had on the side was a 30-year campaign pushing westwards over into Central and Eastern Europe. So one loss in over 4 decades of fighting. And not only was this man a brilliant tactician, but he was a capital C Christian. He was a believer of believers. The title that has been given to him is the Moses of the Middle Ages, because he basically took the pagan Germans, he led them out of their paganism, he gave them a new code of civil laws, he united them legally under the state, and with the help of the church, he united them under the church laws, the ecclesiastical laws. He sounds really cool, right? He sounds like a real man's man, somebody we can all get behind. He wants to be a king like David was king. He wants to go out and he wants to conquer, he wants to lead by example, be on the front lines. But what he did was interesting because he would go out and he would conquer people and he would give them a choice. Convert, be baptized, or die. Because being a pagan, paganism is a capital offense. If you are a pagan, you are guilty of the death penalty. So renounce your religion and be baptized, or at least say that you're a Christian now, or we will kill you. It seems that we can never have a really good mixture of Christian civic leadership when it comes to wielding ultimate power. Now, however, this does get repealed thanks to a man named Alcuin of York. Charlemagne will eventually repeal that. Eventually, Alcuin says, you can force people to be baptized, you can't force them to believe. And he finally gets Charlemagne to see that, and Charlemagne's like, oh, I get it. I can dunk them in water, but it doesn't actually wash their sins away if they don't believe anything. Here's what Alcuin says. Faith is a free act of the will, not a forced act. We must appeal to the conscience, not compel it by violence. You can force people to be baptized, but you cannot force them to believe. Alcuin's a pretty cool guy. We're going to talk about him more in just a little bit. But Charlemagne, he thinks Christianity is fantastic. Not only is Christianity fantastic, both in the personal sense, but he should really govern his nation. In fact, everybody should be governed by what the church teaches. The Bible is the ultimate authority. It should be the ultimate authority for everyone, whether they accept it or not. So we're going to start mixing church and state. He basically saw what Constantine did and said, I think I can do that better. I can do that better than Constantine. So he's going to take lots of bishops and he's going to put them in high positions in government. He's going to make them governors. He's going to put them over whole provinces. He takes Sunday and says it is illegal to work on Sunday. Sunday is a mandatory rest day. If you are in my kingdom, you do not work on Sunday. We keep the Sabbath in my kingdom. You must tithe to your local church or be excommunicated. Like, if you miss one week, you're out. You've got to do penance after that. But he does do some pretty good things as well. He does put out an organized worship liturgy for all the churches in the area to do. So he says, here is a good blueprint for how you can do worship in your church. He's also correct in this sense. He believed that his authority came to him directly from God. Here's a direct quote from him. It is my duty, with the help of the divine mercy, to defend the holy church of God with my arms everywhere. The king's task is the effective strengthening, consolidating, propagating, and preserving of the faith. So this is what the king does. The king strengthens, consolidates, propagates, and preserves the faith. The pope's task is to support the king in this duty by praying for him like Moses with outstretched arms. You kind of get where he's coming from, but at the same time, it feels a little off, right? He believed that political authority should go hand in hand with church power. And a clergy is a very handy means by which he could train and reform the entire society under his control for the service of God. This was his whole doctrine of belief system can be summarized as what's called sacred kingship, which we'll talk about here in a minute. I'm setting up lots of, I'm telling you to put a pin in a lot of things. The story of Charlemagne is kind of a big deal. It's like you have to unfold it and look at one piece at a time. It's like, we're not done talking about Alcuin. Alcuin's going to be a really big deal, but we have to talk about other things first. We have to set the scene. I've mentioned the Carolingian Renaissance without really telling you what it was. Let's talk about the Carolingian Renaissance. This Carolingian sort of blip of wonderful things that are happening. So Charlemagne wanted to use his power to educate people in his kingdom. He wanted to set up schools throughout the entire land, and through these schools, because of the mass education of peoples, this is what's known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The Renaissance, or the rebirth, the renewal that comes about from the lineage of Charles, Charlemagne. Learning flourished, and the foundation is laid for what is actually going to be kind of baseline for the Middle Ages. Do you like stereotypical medieval stories like castles and knights and stuff? It comes from this. Like, the idea of chivalry and high codes of conduct and kings that go out and conquer, it comes from this time period. This one man is responsible for so much of what we understand about Europe and the Middle Ages. I don't think we have very much understanding of all of Europe without this one man. He kind of just sets the stage for all of it. He becomes the archetypal version of that. But you cannot educate the people yourself. So he gathers the top scholars that he can find and brings them in. The one we're going to talk about today is Alcuin of York. He comes and works for Charlemagne starting in 782. He is a Bible commentator, a textual scholar, a liturgical reviser, a defender of orthodoxy against the adoptionists. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that again. He is a reformer of monasteries, a builder of libraries, and a learned astronomer. If you could put all of that in your obituary, that would be awesome. So here are some of the things that he was able to do. We're going to pick just a handful of things that a handful of the pies that he had his fingers in. So language. Do you guys enjoy being able to read and the characters that we use for writing? Think Alcuin. He develops what's called the Carolingian minuscule. It is a standardized set of rules for how you are to write out words and letters. That comes from Alcuin. He revised Latin, all of the letters, they basically come from a version of this. He sets the stage for what will become Old English, which will lead into what we have today. It's fascinating. Alcuin of York, wonderful guy. He revises Latin, and you know how over in the eastern half of the empire they're speaking Greek? Because of this, it's not only the church that's speaking Latin, everybody starts being able to speak Latin at this point. He brings it into, he makes Latin like the official language of the Western fallen empire. In literature, a whole lot of what we've been talking about so far, like whenever I reference ancient documents that are being preserved in monasteries and such, it comes from Alcuin. A whole lot of our surviving texts from ancient Greece and Rome come from Carolingian copies that were made because of monasteries and schools that were set up during this time period. Alcuin uses a veritable army of monk scholars to copy all of these books to make sure that everybody in the kingdom can read them if they want to. He sets up libraries. Not only are monasteries being set up for the training of religious asceticism, but now while they're there, they're writing books. They're copying books over. They are creating libraries that people can go through. And since he wants to set up schools everywhere, these monastery schools, now there are libraries everywhere. They're teaching people to read. They're using a standardized set of characters to be able to do so. And they're making books for people to be able to read. And a whole lot of that is going to, what are they copying? They're copying things that were written in ancient Greece and Rome. So it's because of the work of these men, inspired by Charlemagne and carried out through Alcuin, that we're able to see all of these. How about the Bible? He creates a standardized Latin Vulgate. So we already had a Vulgate, but through some of the translation, maybe there was kind of bad translations. He says, no, this is what's going to be, this is the proper translation of the Vulgate. Education. He ordered bishops and abbots to establish schools for training monks and priests. Every parish, every area, should have a school to educate all male children of the neighborhood, and he founded a royal academy for the study of logic, philosophy, and literature. He was motivated. He was passionate. It is because of him that we have beautiful works of art. If you've ever seen some of the works that ancient monks would do, in the margins, with their inks, it's thank Alcuin. But enough about Alcuin. He's only doing that because Charlemagne told him to do it. Let's talk about Charlemagne some more. So, going back to the idea of sacred kingship, okay? The idea of sacred kingship is that the king is God's vicar on earth. The king is God's representative. The king assumes his throne, and he acts as a representative of God to the people. Now, on one hand, we can say that's how it should be. When you are in a position of authority, you should rule as God would have you rule. On the other hand, though, he's essentially saying, when I speak as with the authority of God. So what I say represents what God says. And again, you're like, if you use that properly, I can see it, but it can be misused so well. The king is God's representative on earth. The church is Christ's representative. The king is God's vicar. The church is Christ's vicar. Who does Christ answer to? So who should the Pope answer to? So basically, he would say that the king is the sole authority, and the church comes around and supports that authority and helps carry out what the king says. So the king, he would say, is et rex et sacerdos, or sacerdos. So the king is both king and priest at the same time. Not only is he ruling in the civic sense of the term, but he's also the priest. He is the mediator between God and man. He's the representative. It's a little weird. He saw himself in the place of God to the world. And as is the case with many people who have way too much power, he's going to overstep it. In the year 790, without consulting the Pope at the time, he issues the church's official response to a controversy. Without talking to the Pope, he says, nope, this is what the church believes about it. So we're going to talk about that controversy. It's called the iconoclastic controversy, which is a fun word. So he writes a series of books called the Caroline books, or the Caroline books. The iconoclastic controversy is essentially, do we venerate images or not? What is the role of icons in the church? He basically kind of waffles between two. He basically says that you cannot bow down before icons, you cannot kiss them, you cannot burn incense or candles in front of them. He rejects the stories of miracles that are worked by icons, but he does say that religious honor should be paid to the sign of the cross and to the relics of the saints. So he's kind of like, no, we don't worship them, but we do honor them. Okay. Where do you draw the line, guy? And now, how about this? If you are familiar with the Nicene Creed, where does the Holy Spirit come from? The Holy Spirit issues forth from the Father, and depending on the version you read, most of them are going to say, and from the Son. Charlemagne is the reason why that is so spread. The inclusion of that the Holy Spirit comes from both the Father and the Son. It's called the Filioque Clause. The Filioque Clause. So from the 6th century onwards, Western Christians add in from the Son to the line that says that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And there's going to be a Council of Toledo, which is a great name, in the year 589 that adds the Filioque Clause. The Fili means the Son, if you did not know your Latin. The East protests. They say that, no, the West does not have any right to officially update this creed that we've had for over 500 years at this point. You don't get to alter an ecumenical creed. An ecumenical means that it spans all areas of the church. All of the churches agree to this one thing, the entire ecumen. So he disagrees with the Pope, Pope Leo III. Pope Leo III said, no, we're not going to include the Filioque Clause in there. And Charlemagne said, but we are. So Pope Leo agrees that the Holy Spirit issues forth from both the Father and the Son, but he didn't think it was right to add that into the ecumenical creed. He didn't say this is not something that is a salvific issue, so it's not something that we're going to force the other churches to add into their confession. But I believe it's true. But Charlemagne said, no, we're going to make them add it into their confession. So how about what happens next? So Charlemagne doesn't just stay king. He becomes emperor. Emperor Charlemagne. And there are several legends as to what happens, but you're going to have the easiest time remembering when Charlemagne was made emperor. Christmas Day in the year 800. December 25th, 800. If you have trouble remembering that, I'm not sure I can help you. It's a famous day, and it's an even-numbered year. So there are several legends about what happens there. He's been off conquering, and essentially he comes back to Rome, and he goes and attends the Mass. And as he's doing it, suddenly everyone's around him, and like, oh, the Pope has a crown, and he's putting it on Charlemagne's head, and he's crowning him emperor. And Charlemagne's, I don't even know what to do about this. I can't refuse. So, I guess I'm the emperor now, is essentially what happens. So he'd been fighting the Saxons, he'd been fighting the Spanish, he'd been fighting the Muslims, he'd been fighting the Lombards. Basically, he has a whole lot of land now. This is the most land belonging to a single person since the fall of the Roman Empire. That's kind of interesting, right? So maybe the empire's back, you know? We're going out, we're conquering new lands, we're adding new people all the time. How about Roman Empire 2.0? But where do we get the idea that we can now appoint an emperor? We'll come back to that. But there are several people who believed that it was right and it was just for them to be able to appoint him as emperor. There was a dubious emperor, or rather empress, in the East. And so the church felt that maybe they could get away with saying, hey, this is the emperor now. But the idea behind this is that with Charlemagne, because we have a man's man, because we have a wonderful, ideal king before us, and now an emperor, the golden days of the Roman Empire are back. The Roman Empire has fallen no more. You can lose the name the Byzantine Empire because Rome is back. So Pope Leo crowns Charlemagne as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the West. It's not great. Used to be that the church and the state were basically doing their own thing. Well, now, since he has such a high view of what the king should do, we have a unification of church and state at this point. It started with his grandfather, Charles Chuck the Hammer Martel. We love him. But now we have the emperor and the pope working in close conjunction with each other. Because the pope made the emperor. So the emperor relies on the pope, right? But the pope is underneath the emperor, right? So who has the authority? The man who makes the emperor, or the emperor who the man answers to? It's kind of an interesting thing. But here's where we've got a full picture of Christendom. A Christian nation, a world that is the church. Something that people have foolishly pushed for thousands of years, but we will never see its full culmination until after Christ returns again. But in this instance, we have a new emperor. We've got a political and religious power governing the lives and the worship of people. Because you remember, he said there's a standard for liturgy that you have to follow in your church. So now we have the full integration of the Frankish government and the Roman papacy, a French emperor and the Roman pope. So in the year 800, we've got a whole lot of things coming together. It's kind of like this crystallization of what's been happening. The Roman bishop is unquestionably the prime church leader in the West and the personal representative of Western Christianity to the East. You remember there's kind of a fracture between the East and the West? So the Roman Pope is he's top dog, and he's the representative of the church to the East. But also they're kind of straying out from their realm of governance that's been given to them by the Lord, because now they have essentially given themselves supreme worldly power. Yes, we can appoint a leader over the world as we know it. The church can do that now. Solely. So the papacy, the pope, is gradually expanding their influence beyond the scope of the church and into more of a political power. And for the most part, we can see that as a bad thing when the church and the state wield supreme power over people. However, for the next 800 to 1,000 years, Europe is going to be a Christian nation, at least nominally. All politics, all learning, all social organization, all art, all music, economics, law, it all has its roots in Christianity. I mean, not necessarily rooted in the gospel, but in the religion of Christianity. Kind of a big deal. And in fact, ironically, there's another well-known French, I'll use the term emperor, you might have heard of, who saw himself as a second Charlemagne, followed in his footsteps a lot. Napoleon? And it's around the time of Napoleon when this kind of goes away. In fact, we've got a new empire here. Because we talked about the fall of Rome, but there's a key phrase that you may have heard before that we haven't talked about at all up until this moment, because now that we have a fully Christian emperor in step with the church right now, do you know what we have? We've got the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, who is now going to look at Charlemagne as the supreme authority and example for how they're going to live their lives for essentially ever. You know where Charlemagne was conquering the pagans and he gave them a choice, convert to Christianity or perish? Well, wouldn't you know it, whenever we start talking about the Crusades, they're going to be looking to Charlemagne's example for how this goes down. There's a whole lot that we could say about Charlemagne, about the goodness and the badness. Was he a good example? Was he not? What can we take from him? What can we not? In your notes, I have included a reference for you to go and check out a podcast that I listen to, a history podcast that talks just about Charlemagne. It's like 50 minutes long. It's well worth it. I can get you the link specifically if you want, and if you want it, you can send me a message. You can even I can put it in the comments of the video. But if you're interested, check it out. If you're a masochist, type out the entire link that I've included in your notes and hope that you type it in correctly. Or if you just go to YouTube and search what I've written down there, you'll find it. Fully recommend listening to that because there's a lot of more interesting detail that he goes into that I can't do it right now. But however, let's swap over to the papacy real quick. We're going to talk about the church. So Charlemagne is there. He has set the stage for what's essentially going to be Europe. In fact, Europe is where it comes here. And Charlemagne gets the term Pater Europus because he's the father of Europe. He unites all of his people and creates the state of Europe. The state, the nation, essentially. The Moses, where he goes out and he creates all these disparate peoples all living in the same area and brings them together with one unifying clause. Charlemagne is the reason that Europe exists. And not just Europe, but like he shapes the course of history through the Middle Ages even to now. In fact, the words that I'm reading right now are a result of Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And he really was great in the terms of that, how we understand and greatness. So let's see what the popes were doing, the papacy, shall we say. They started getting a little too big for the britches. Believe it or not, they started moving out and like, what if we didn't just take control of the church? What if we started putting our influence into politics as well? So in France, and it is France now, it's no longer the Franks, but France because of the Carolingian dynasty, we need alliances. If you're the church, you need some political backing because, the empire fell 300 years ago. You kind of need somebody to have your back, and the Franks are pretty prominent in terms of warfare. So they get military alliances, and the kings of France have the moral support of Rome because they need a way to help keep the pagans in line. Boniface gets sent up into Poland and France and Germany. They keep sending Boniface up there, and Boniface is kind of a big deal. Feel free to do some more research on him if you would like to. Because they keep sending him up there, Boniface keeps bringing back more and more reports of what's happening up there, so the papacy gets more and more involved into what's happening in the northern kingdoms up there. So, remember how the church crowned Pepin the Short as king? It makes you wonder if they made him kneel down before they put the crown on his head, right? Like, how short was Pepin? And also, it's very interesting. If you listen to the podcast I told you about, they're going to do a physical description of Charlemagne. World's best swimmer, by the way. Everyone thought so. Everyone thought he was the world's best swimmer. Okay, so Pepin becomes king, and through this, because the Pope has now through Boniface, crowned the king, we are now no longer tied to Constantinople, because the emperor in Constantinople wouldn't think very well of the church in the West usurping authority and saying, no, you can be the king. And not only are you the king, but when Pepin comes in and he conquers Lombard territory, there's like a big H-type shape of land that he takes from the Lombards that really should be given back to the Byzantine emperor. He doesn't do that. He gives it to the Pope. He gives it a donation that gives them a huge amount of land called the Papal States. The Papal States. And wouldn't you know it, when you have land that's been given to the church, that land needs to be run. That land needs to be regulated. I mean, it's the church's land, so maybe the church should run it, right? So Pepin's gift to Pope Stephen increases the rift between Eastern and Western churches by giving him basically the entirety of northern Italy. And we are good Baptists. We do not drink. But if you were not and you played a drinking game for every time I mentioned that tensions arose or there's a division that happens between the East and the West, you would lose the game because there'd be too much drinking. It's just it keeps happening over and over and over through the centuries. So up until that point, northern Italy had been under Byzantine control. It's taken by the Lombards and then given to the Pope. And Pepin says, hey, I am free to do this because I love the church and because I want to honor St. Peter and his successors by giving that land to the Pope. So we have the Papal State, and now the popes are not just going to be heads of the church, but they're going to be the heads of the Papal States. They're going to be the de facto rulers of that. And this is really, really funny, because history is really funny sometimes, given proper context. Around this time, maybe a little before, there was a long-lost letter that was found called the Donation of Constantine. Wouldn't it be very convenient if a letter that claimed to be from Constantine himself to Pope Sylvester, in which Constantine says that the Pope is superior to the emperor and gives the Pope the right to govern the city of Rome and all imperial territory in Italy and the West? Because, I mean, Constantine, he's going over to Constantinople. He's got a whole city named after him now. So, popes over in the West in Italy, you can run it however you like. For 700 years, anytime somebody raised a fuss, they would bring out the donation to Constantine. He said we could do it. You all love Constantine, and Constantine said that we're the best, so we're the best. You trust us. Turns out it was a fake. Duh. It was very clearly a fake. There's an Italian scholar named Lorenzo Valla in 1440. But for 700 years, the popes were just like this made-up piece of paper that basically says, I can do what I want, or you can do what you want, love Constantine. It's awfully convenient. It's awfully convenient to be given a license. Imagine if Donald Trump found like a thing that was like, I found a letter from George Washington that said that every president can do this specific thing, and there's nothing anybody can say about it. And we're like, well, yeah, I mean, George Washington. It would be awfully convenient, that's all I'm saying, and I feel like people should have, I mean, it was the Dark Ages, not everybody was educated. We should give them a little bit of leniency there. But that's not enough, because we've got to slide further into some theological thickets, or how about some setbacks? So let's talk about adoptionism. Just two more things. Adoptionism. So there are two Spanish bishops who put forth the idea that although Christ in his divine nature is the eternal Son of God, in his human nature, he gets adopted as the Son of God because we are adopted as sons of God, and we are like Christ. So instead of us being just like Jesus, what if Jesus is kind of like how we are? We have that same sort of relationship where his human nature wasn't a son of God, but was rather adopted into it. That's heresy. The root of the issue is whether or not sonship belongs to person or to nature. And if you'll remember, we've already had like a big disagreement about whether nature or person even means in relation to Jesus. The adoptionists are going to say that it belongs to nature. Since Christ has two natures, that would mean there would be two sonships. So Jesus is two sons of God. There is an eternal divine sonship, which we would all agree with, but then there is a human adopted sonship. No? However, this was really popular. It spread from Spain over into France, and it caused a very, very major controversy. Orthodoxy, which again is like tried, true, like we're standing upon the Bible, and that is where we're defining our doctrine from. They argue that sonship belongs to person. It is as a person that Jesus is the eternal Son of God. Therefore, Christ cannot have an additional human sonship unless he has a separate human personality, which, as we all know, is Nestorianism, which is heresy. It's heresy. So it is Nestorian heresy to say that there are two sons in Christ, a divine son and an adopted human son, because, of course, it is heresy to say that there are two persons of Christ. And at the Council of Frankfurt in 794, it is deposed. It is officially rendered heresy. You are no longer allowed to think that and be in good graces with the church. One more controversy. One more. And it's really funny, but we're going to talk more about this stuff a little bit next time because there are some really interesting people to talk about, like Rattrumnus and, is it Radbernal, I think? It's been a few days since I've read it, and I haven't slept very much since then, so you'll have to bear with me. We're going to talk about them a little bit next week. So let's talk about the iconoclast controversy. The iconoclast, which as you'll recall, Charlemagne issued the church's official response to this. This has to deal with icons. The role of icons in the church. If you'll remember, there were plenty of people who said that church icons are essentially like flannel graph. It's a way to tell the Bible to people who can't read. And because of that, we should treat it with respect. We respect the flannel graph because it can convey the gospel, even if you can't read, which at this point, a lot of the church leadership can't read, so that's not great. But it's renderings of Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints, angels in heaven, both in pictures or in statues, mosaics, wood, stone, carvings. You might have heard of bas-relief, those kinds of things. To this day, strict orthodoxy says no, absolutely not. And in fact, we can also look at the 10 Commandments, Commandment number 2, which says, "You shall not make for yourself an image of God." So that always is in the back of my head anytime my kid brings out a book and it's got like a picture of Jesus in there. Like, does this violate the second commandment? Does it? Oh, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but it is definitely something to consider. How do we render images of real people who did real things, and especially pictures depicting God? Because there are plenty of people, cartoonists, who have depicted the traditional Christian God, and you know what he looks like. I mean, what about the famous painters of the actual Renaissance period? Does that violate the second commandment? Interesting to think about. It's beautiful work, but is it sinful? So, to this day, Orthodoxy opposes statues of Christ, Mary, saints, angels, all of it. But here are some defenses. The icon reveals the presence of Christ, even an icon of a saint, because what made the saint a saint? It was Jesus. So when we venerate the picture of the person, by that we venerate the person, and we venerate the person who became the person because of the work of Jesus, which seems like a really twisted strand of logic that you go through just to get to, even though we're like bowing down to this statue, it's really because of Jesus that we're bowing down to the statue. I don't think so. But they would say that bowing, kissing, lighting incense, these are acts of homage or homage to Christ, who is present with us because we're we're with him as we worship the icons of these people. John of Damascus argues that the incarnation shows that God made it possible to paint the portrait of a man. God created an icon in Jesus. He created an image of himself. Like, you can kind of understand where his logic is coming from, but at the same time, like, can you say that with full authority and like, no, yep, this is correct. So many in the East embraced this view, even considering that a church was not even a true holy place unless it had images and icons to aid worship and in faith. It's like you might say, like, it's not really a church if you don't have a steeple. They would say it's not a church if you don't have pictures of the saints or statues of Mary hanging around. So through the Renaissance, we're now promoting the arts, and leading breakthroughs in the arts means that there is more art that is created, and everything is rooted in Christianity, right? So a lot of the art tends to be Christian, so they tend to be pictures of Mary or of Jesus. And this is setting the stage for what's going to happen later on with the full Renaissance, whenever you actually get like the really, really famous pictures, paintings. Yeah, and they would say that just like flannel graph, like seeing these things leads to a deeper faith. This can be the open door that leads people into Christianity. We bring them in with the beauty of our art, and that art leads them to question, like, why are we depicting this person this way? And it leads into the gospel. And I want to say, yes, but where do you draw the line on that? And if you're Charlemagne, you know exactly where to draw the line because he issued the official response. But it's not just in churches, because these little icons appear in homes, in shops, on jewelry, on signs. How about clothing? It's everywhere. And there are some people who would say that these icons were created miraculously. Like those people who would come up today and like, look, this picture of my toast, it burned a picture of the Virgin Mary into my toast. They would say that that is a miracle that has been done by God. We should venerate this piece of bread. It is, like, if you're coming from that worldview, I can understand why you would think that. But from where I sit and how I understand the holy word of God, I do not get it. Because when you admire something and when you adore something, what's the line between admiration, adoration, and worship? Where do you draw that line? So that's the iconoclast controversy. How do we feel about icons in the church? Is it idolatry? Is it not? It's idolatry. Is it though? It is. But this is going to be, again, another big controversy. Everyone is arguing about it. Everyone is fighting about it. People are being killed over it because, of course, the church always gets along very well and doesn't resort to violence. But this essentially, the big battleground for this area is in the east. It's over in Constantinople or Byzantium, depending on how you want to view it. So Leo II is the emperor from 717 over to 740. He's not a big fan. He is not a fan. He declares war on every single icon. He believed that he was called by God to cleanse the Eastern Empire of all idolatry, or else have the dominion of the Eastern Empire suffer the wrath of God. He began a campaign against images in 726, seeking to destroy them all. So, for example, in Constantinople, there is a giant golden image of Jesus, the most prominent imagery of the city. It's like if somebody was like, I don't like American idolatry, we're going to go tear down the Statue of Independence, or Statue of Liberty. You don't do that. That's America's thing, you know? So there's a giant golden statue of Jesus, and Leo's soldiers tear it down. They tear it down. There is an officer who is in charge of these soldiers, and there is a group of women who take the leader of these soldiers and they beat him to death with their household items. Brooms, mops, various kitchen tools. So they come in. So Leo orders the soldiers to get rid of the icons. They get rid of the icons. Some ladies are so upset that they kill a man, and Leo orders their execution as a result of this. So he issues an edict against icons. He requires images to be destroyed, calling them idolatrous. Again, I agree with the sentiment behind it, but maybe he saw himself as a modern-day Gideon, you know? Only he's not doing it at night. He's doing it in full daylight in view of all the very angry girls. He argues that depicting Christ as a man kind of prevents someone that you're also showing that he's God as well. So a picture, a human representation of Jesus it's a form of Nestorianism again, because you're only depicting Jesus as human, right? You can't possibly depict Jesus as God if you're giving him, making him an image. So if you are going to attack where icons are housed, where are you going to go? The churches, the monasteries, the same places that the Vikings are going to start raiding at. We're going to talk about the Vikings here in the next week or two. So the monasteries all get raided and their icons get thrown out. The Roman popes are going to back up the iconophiles or the icon lovers because they believe that the icon-loving position is essentially, it's accurate. The iconoclasts are the people who are against idols, so iconophiles, pro, iconoclasts, against. They believe that the iconoclast emperors were overstepping their bounds in subjecting the Eastern Church to the state. So, over in the East, you've got a bunch of people, the state's overstepping its bounds, but then over in the West with Charlemagne, you've got, yes, the church and the state are working together. Please tell us what to do. Pope Gregory II, so over back in Rome, he condemns iconoclasm. And again, this is going to really be an issue of church and state. Who has the right to declare what in regards to the state versus the church? Ugh. The religious leaders and the people revolt against Leo II's ban on images. He uses arms to enforce it. Remember, he hired the soldiers to go out and take care of it as well. His son, Constantine V, continues on being an iconoclast. A council is called by Constantine V in 754 with 338 iconoclast bishops. Guess what they ruled? Icons are bad. It's kind of what happens when you stack the council with people who are your people. Constantine's son, Leo IV, things relax a little bit because he married a girl who loved icons. She was an iconophile, so you know what? We're going to ease off just a little bit because I don't want to make my wife angry. You will remember that the people in the West thought it was okay for them to crown a new emperor. Here's why. Because Constantine VI, which he was around during the Second Council of Nicaea, he's too young to rule. So you know what happens? We have the queen mother, the emperor mother. His mom rules the empire in his stead. So what happens is he becomes emperor. She doesn't really want to get rid of power, so he kicks her out, and then she comes back and usurps the throne and takes the title of empress for herself. So there's a little bit of shaky ground as to who's actually in charge. And it's because of this, Empress Irene, that they see we have the right to set up for ourselves a new emperor. We want the Roman Empire 2.0. Anyway, proclaimed it was unlawful to worship images. It was necessary to venerate them, though. Don't worship them, just honor them highly. Make it make sense. So again, middle of the road respect, did nothing to fix the issues happening between church and state. It did not solve the iconoclastic controversy. And you just want to say, come on, Irene. So, what to do with all this? Whole lot of information to take in. How do we feel about icons? Like, can they inspire us to worship? Yes. But do we need them? No. Can they be helpful? there are plenty of things where I think these are a matter of conscience. And I feel that if you have to ask the question, it's far better to err on the side of conservative. If this can be an issue, we should avoid this. That is my official stance, because anything can be an idol if it takes the place of God in our life when it comes to worship, of adoration, etc. And if we're not careful, anything could take that place, even something that's intended for good. For instance, we can take the physical Bible itself and have that as an idol in our life, as opposed to the actual message and words that it says. Like we can't do anything to the Bible, not even read it. It's not a good look. But my encouragement to all of you is to keep reading about Alcuin and Charlemagne, because we're already going late, and there's so much more I could say about them, but I'm not going to. I hope that I've whet your appetite for them. We're going to talk some more about some church controversies next time and big arguments, particularly over more icons and predestination. We're going to start talking about that. That's a fun conversation to have. Okay, any questions? Yeah, John of Damascus, he made a... He basically argued that God created an icon when he took the form of Jesus. So he's an iconphile. Leo, yes, Leo the Second, 726. 726. He was emperor from 717 to 40, and about 9 years into his rule, he started that, and it would be continued on until he died, and then his son would take up the charge. But then his grandson, of course, with his wife, was like, maybe it's not all that bad. I mean, they're just pictures. What harm can they do? They really are. Oh, maybe Ephesus 2 is the last council that we do. Yeah, it's one of those. But yeah, they've had plenty of councils since then. But all of these don't really add much to the conversation. Like they're the church is leading more towards like the fringes. Like they're arguing about things that don't really need to be argued about. Like there are certain things that needed to be settled. Like we need to understand that this is a big deal. These other ones, like they're councils, but they are less about creating a universal answer for the church and more how can we progress our stance and force everyone else to agree to it. Yeah, right. I mean, we basically like there's more to the councils than just these things. These councils they're going to say yes, this is heresy, no, this is not heresy, but it's almost like bills in Congress where you can like be like, yeah, I really like that part, but I can't fully support the whole bill, especially because it's being put forth by a political party that wants nothing to do with me and what I think is the best interests going forward. Kind of like that. There are so many councils, but in terms of truly ecumenical church-wide, we're starting to splinter and fracture, and they're not fully ecumenical even more, even though they say they are. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, they're going to be coming in here soon to listen to much better speakers than me, so I'm going to go ahead and pray, and we're gonna call it. God, we thank you for your goodness. We're so glad to be able to come back and examine history and look at the complicated examples of men and women throughout history about how they can do so much good. And looking at Charlemagne, he really was a great man, capital G great. And we know that that authority came to him, and we hope that we can look to him as an example of how to lead well and how to stand up for truth. But perhaps we do not look to him as an example of mercy. And I pray that you would give us the discernment necessary to understand when to look for examples in history and when to decry the actions. We thank you that we have one true example to look to, the man, God, Jesus Christ. I pray that you would give us discernment, that we would look at these arguments that the church has had for hundreds of years about who you are and what that means, about what the proper place of things are in the church, and that we would use discernment, not based on our own reasoning or understanding, but that we would look to your word to understand what the truth actually is. Pray you would give us a hunger and a desire to know more about you and your word overall, Lord. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. See you next week.